Hey, good morning, y'all. Josh's Severe Weather. Happy Thursday to you. We are continuing to track Hurricane Lee, a large, powerful storm which is beginning to impact Bermuda. And we now have hurricane watches in effect for portions of Maine and the Maritimes of Canada. I'm going to talk more about that. Let me share my screen with you here. Then we're going to talk about the next couple of storms as well. We do have a hurricane watch in effect as we are going to be looking at least tropical storm winds, if not potentially low-end hurricane force winds spanning across parts of down eastern Maine and moving into the Bay of Fundy and affecting southwestern portions of Nova Scotia. So this will be one of the more powerful storms to hit this area in recent years. New Brunswick and eastern Maine have not been under a hurricane watch since, I believe, 2008. And while this storm may be weakening some more by the time it gets up here, it's going to bring quite a bit of impact with it, especially storm surge, but also very heavy rain and briefly very strong winds. Bermuda beginning to feel those winds this morning. So we are going to talk a lot about this storm. And I'm also going to talk a little bit more about the next couple of threats as well. Here's a look at the National Hurricane Center's outlook. And you can see Hurricane Lee tracking to the south and west of Bermuda. That's this little bit of a blip right here. Clearly not a threat to the southeastern U.S., although we'll be dealing with some pretty high surf and rip currents here over the next several days due to the large swells coming out of Lee. We also have Hurricane Margot, which has begun to weaken and beginning to be affected by wind shear, and that is not going to be a threat to land, and just another name on the list. Another area to keep a very close eye on here now has a 90% chance of becoming our next tropical depression or storm by the weekend. The next name on the list is Nigel. And there could be another wave behind that one later next week. The next name after that is Ophelia. That might be kind of the back end of the Cape Verde season. So let's take a look at the visible slash infrared imagery. And you can see the U.S., the Gulf, and the Caribbean are clear of any hazards. All the action is out over the open waters of the Atlantic, where we do typically like to see it, of course. But you know, these storms are getting steered more westward due to the fact that we have just a massive area of high pressure in place over here. And that is giving us at least something to watch and not just waving to fish storms, if that makes any sense. But here's Lee, and you can see the size of the system is growing. Even though the most intense winds are in this area, it continues to grow. It was about this big a few days ago. It's about doubled in size now. This is Bermuda right here. So the storm is passing by to the west of Bermuda. And it's going to kind of loop around in here before making a right turn somewhere near the U.S.-Canadian border, or perhaps a little bit closer to Nova Scotia, maybe briefly closer to Cape Cod before turning away. So there's still going to be some uncertainty on the exact track, and I'm going to break that down for you here. This is Hurricane Margot, and this system will be heading out to sea and continuing to weaken. Why is the carpet wet, Todd? I don't know, Margot. Please tell me you've seen that movie. And then here's AL97, a tropical disturbance which does not yet have really a closed-off circulation, but it is growing in size, much like we saw with Lee here about 11 days ago. This one looks a lot like Lee, but it is going to be taking a slightly different track, it appears. So we're going to talk about that here. Here's the infrared, and you can see all the features on the map. Let me change colors. That green didn't seem to work out pretty well here. We can do pink. This is Hurricane Lee right over here off the east coast, passing by the southwest of Bermuda. It'll make its closest approach to Bermuda overnight tonight. Here's Hurricane Margot, expected to gradually weaken and slow down. This is AL97 right here. Tropical disturbance, which is going to likely be our next system here in a couple of days as it moves west-northwest. We do have a region of high pressure that's separating these storms from merging, and it's also keeping this disturbance away. We've got a bit of an upper level low, a bit of a weakness here that's come in underneath, and that is going to eventually steer this system up in that direction. But as that upper low lifts away, high pressure rebuilds, and it may try to turn back more to the west-northwest. That should look like a very familiar track to many of us. We got another wave that we're going to keep an eye on. Models aren't really developing it, but the one behind it has maybe a little bit better chance at this point. So that's what the Atlantic looks like. I'm glad to see the Gulf is still pretty quiet. The Eastern Pacific and Central America are quiet. And in the Caribbean, actually pretty decent weather here other than the rough surf. Pretty good cruising weather here. So Hurricane Lee has definitely changed in the internal structure of the system. It's grown, and we no longer have a central tight core. We've got a broader area of Category 1 and 2 hurricane force winds with very intense wind in here. Because of that, the storm has grown. The amount of surge and wave action is growing, and it's battering Bermuda now with some high surf. but it is on the weakening trend. So fortunately, winds are starting to come down with this system and will continue to do so. We do see some rain bands on the Bermuda radar right now. These heavier bands are primarily staying south and west of Bermuda, but as the storm tracks more northwestward, we will see these bands moving onshore. Kind of feeder bands. We're not really going to see the central dense overcast portion of the storm that brings the highest rain rates and the heaviest amounts of wind, fortunately, here in Bermuda. But we are still going to be dealing with some effects for the next 24 to 48 hours. Wind speeds are now down to 100 miles per hour. It's a Category 2 hurricane, pretty much following the forecast that we've expected. The storm is going to bend to the right and go more northeast and weaken over cooler waters left behind by Hurricane Franklin here last month, and should get down to Category 1 strength by tonight and remain a Category 1 storm as it turns back towards the north or even northwest. It's going to be down to high-end tropical storm strength, but the big question mark is, does that happen over Nova Scotia, or is it still a minor or a borderline Category 1 hurricane with 75-mile-per-hour winds? If that's the case, it would be Friday night, Saturday morning. So there are hurricane watches posted for this area, but it will be weakening down the tropical storm strength by the time it gets through the Maritimes here and continues over Prince Edward Island and then towards Newfoundland here later Sunday and Sunday night, and then becomes an extratropical gale system south of Greenland. At that point, we don't have to worry about it. You can see here the pinks on the map are where our hurricane watches are in effect, and the yellows are where our tropical storm watches, and the blue is the tropical storm warning for Bermuda. The track pretty well behaved here, should start to bend back to the left, no longer expected to be right off of the islands and Cape Cod, but Nantucket's still under that tropical storm watch. More of a threat potentially for eastern Maine and southern parts of New Brunswick, and certainly southwestern Nova Scotia. And the reason why is this storm is very big, as I'm going to show you. You see this wind field here. The red area of hurricane force winds, it'll eventually shrink down here, but the area of tropical storm force winds could impact the area from Cape Cod all the way over to Halifax at the same time. So it's a very wide storm system with a lot of far-reaching impacts. Here's a close-in look at the hurricane watches, and you can see those are in effect basically from just east of Bar Harbor, or actually just west of Bar Harbor. So basically Stonington, Maine, right up the coast here towards Eastport, and then right across the border into southwestern New Brunswick all the way to Maces Bay. And then we've got a tropical storm watch from Maces Bay, which is just southwest of St. John, all the way over here into Minas Basin and into the southwestern portion of Nova Scotia to Digby. We've got a hurricane watch from Digby around through Yarmouth and around towards near Bridgewater, and a tropical storm watch for Bridgewater and Halifax right through the central coast of Nova Scotia. This map doesn't really give me any more than that. We also have a tropical storm watch south and west of Stonington, Maine, through the remainder of down east Maine, down through Portland, down through the New Hampshire seacoast, down through the entire coast of Massachusetts, which includes Cape Cod Bay, Buzzards Bay, Boston Harbor, Nantucket Sound, Falmouth, New Bedford, Fall River, Narragansett Bay, all the way down to the Rhode Island, Connecticut border, and that includes Block Island under that tropical storm watch. And we do have a storm surge watch as well, I believe, which you can see here in the pink. Actually, this may even be, let me see. Yeah, storm surge watch. And that includes all of Cape Cod, basically from south of Plymouth, right around Cape Cod Bay to Provincetown, and coming around to the southern end of Cape Cod, and that includes Nantucket as well. And this is where the worst of the storm surge is expected to be, as this storm is not going to be winding down the tropical storm strength quite yet. So the higher amounts of surge are likely to batter the northwestern side of the circulation and hammer Cape Cod Bay here with a few feet of storm surge. You can see that on the map. We're expecting 2 to 4 feet of storm surge coming into Cape Cod Bay, all the way down to Chatham, Mass. 2 to 4 feet as well on Nantucket. West of that area, 1 to 3 feet of storm surge over Martha's Vineyard, over the south coast of Cape Cod, all of Rhode Island, even into Long Island Sound. 1 to 2 feet of storm surge from Rockaway Inlet to Montauk Point. And then on the northeastern side here of New England, we have from basically Sagamore Beach through Boston Harbor and Buzzards Bay, right up the north coast here, and all the way along the Maine coast, 1 to 3 feet of storm surge expected. The National Hurricane Center does not do storm surge forecasts for Canada, but we will likely see at least 1 to 3 feet across all of the south coast of New Brunswick, across the Bay of Fundy, and across the southwestern third to half of Nova Scotia along the coastline, maybe even higher amounts getting in the Bay of Fundy based on the fact that it's a concave coast and that water funnels right up through there. And I think those of you that are in that area are pretty familiar with that phenomenon, but certainly that provides some hazards here to coastal areas that could get hit with storm surge. You can see the wind field has continued to grow. We're not expecting hurricane force winds to get to Bermuda, but tropical storm force winds are basically knocking on the door. We'll have tropical storm force winds in Bermuda later this morning, right through the night tonight, and then gradually improving as the system pulls away tomorrow morning. Hurricane force winds should stay over open waters, providing only hazards to mariners. Here's the model forecast intensity. We'll stay at category 2 for probably the majority of today and fall into category 1 by tonight. We will see gradual weakening as the storm gets more wind shear and dry air into it and cooler waters. It'll pass over here over the next 24 to 48 hours. And the big question mark is, will this still be a hurricane as it passes Cape Cod? It's going to be very close at this point. I think by the time it does come up through eastern Maine and into Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, it's a tropical storm. It may even be extra tropical. But those of us saw in Hurricane Sandy, that had lost its tropical characteristics, but maintained its size, maintained its wind. And Lee is about half the size of what Sandy was, but still a powerful storm. So the impacts are going to be a lot bigger than just what the maximum sustained winds are. And I think you all hopefully do understand that. A look at the model shows pretty good agreement. They've shifted back to the right just a little bit. My forecast yesterday was calling for just south and west of Eastport. I may be shifting that into New Brunswick a little bit here. Regardless, it's going to impact the same areas we've been forecasting. There's no way that this thing turns out and misses land. It's going over the Maritimes, and the western side of it's going to hammer coastal New England. It'll weaken by the time it gets up into Newfoundland, Labrador. It should be an extra tropical 40 to 50 mile per hour storm, which should not batter you guys any worse than some of the winter storms do. So fortunately, by then it's a weaker system. And you can see ensembles have kind of gone back and forth a little to the west. Now they're back to the east. Official landfall point actually looks like it's right around Yarmouth here in Nova Scotia. The earliest arrival of tropical storm winds are this morning here in Bermuda, and then in Long Island and Rhode Island and southern Mass, we're looking at that onset of tropical storm force winds probably later tomorrow afternoon, more likely though tomorrow evening, and then heading up into Maine and southwest Nova Scotia later tomorrow night. And then those winds expand into New Brunswick in the morning on Saturday, into Prince Edward Island during the day, and then into the Gulf of St. Lawrence Saturday night, into Newfoundland here by Sunday morning. So timing of the system's in pretty good agreement right now. It will speed up a little bit. Here's the likelihood of tropical storm force winds, pretty high all the way up into Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and eastern Maine, a little lower over portions of eastern Mass and Connecticut. But still, even parts of Long Island could see tropical storm force winds. Same goes for eastern half of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and across much of Maine and pretty much all of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are going to see tropical storm force winds out of this system. Here's a look at the GEFS, and you can see that the operational GFS is west of the mean, but really we don't see anything hitting Cape Cod. There's one ensemble that shows that. I don't think that's as likely. More likely we see tracks closer to Maine and especially New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and then right over Prince Edward Island, and then moving into northwestern parts of Newfoundland up to Labrador at that point, non-tropical. Here's a look at the ensembles, and you can see pretty good agreement on timing here over the next couple of days, then more spread. Just a couple of ensembles still are tickling Cape Cod here as we get into Saturday afternoon and early evening. A few others over into western parts of Nova Scotia. So there's still about a 300, 250 mile spread here. So about 400 kilometer spread in where the ensembles take it. But the ellipse has gotten smaller and pretty much settles right into the Bay of Fundy here by Saturday night. And then it starts growing after that. Not really going to talk too much about ensembles, but let's take a look at the probability of hurricane force winds, because I think this is an important forecast. And you can see Bermuda does have a slight chance of hurricane force winds. I don't really think that's going to happen. Mainly some gusts that are getting close to that. But then you see the probability of hurricane force winds, according to the ensembles, is below 10% over the area that it's expecting to see landfall. It doesn't mean we're not going to see tropical storm force winds. You can see that area is close to 100% over the same area. But right now we're expecting, the ensembles are expecting the system will be below hurricane strength as it comes in here. Does not mean it's not going to be a big nasty storm that causes a lot of damage. Tropical storms can cause damage, especially large ones like this one. That's basically still has the skeleton of a hurricane, just doesn't have the core of the strongest winds. And here's a look at what's driving the system to make the turn. We've got a trough that's moving through eastern Canada today, bringing a nice cold front through. It's going to be a chilly night tonight over interior parts of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, certainly chilly over the Great Lakes. But that trough weakens and lifts out, and we've got a ridge of high pressure that builds back in here tomorrow. You can see it kind of nosing back into Nova Scotia, and that's going to keep this from going out to sea. There's no way it goes out to sea based on the fact that this ridge puts up a big block here tomorrow. But the good news is that we do have another trough moving in, and that's going to break the ridge up here on Saturday and allow the storm to eventually make a right turn. And there's still a bit of uncertainty on where that turn happens. It could be, just east of Cape Cod into the central Maine seacoast. It could happen sooner and come up closer to Halifax, but the model average takes it right up through the Bay of Fundy at this point, maybe clipping the southwest coast here of Nova Scotia as that trough pushes it away. And then unsettled weather returns to the northeast here later in the weekend. It'll be cooler, and we are going to see more showers and storms as well. Here's a look at wind gusts on Bermuda, and you can see they are predicted to get up to about 50 miles per hour this morning, and then 60 to 70 miles per hour this afternoon and early evening, and then should start to let up after that. Here's a look at wind gusts on the East Coast, and we can see the European has backed off on Cape Cod. It was showing 80 to 90 mile per hour wind gusts, now showing 60 to 70. So probably not dealing with hurricane force winds, but it'll get kind of close there. Even on the Maine seacoast, 50 to 60 mile per hour wind gusts. So only if this system weakens as fast as it's expected to. Farther back into western New England, we're not going to see gusts over 40. Eastern New England, generally speaking, between 35 and 55 miles per hour. The mountains, of course, will see stronger winds. Mount Washington will probably get up to 100. And then back in the Northeast, we're looking at 20 to 30 mile per hour winds. Actually be a nice cool breeze. So enjoy it while you can this weekend here. Taking a look at rainfall totals, and you can see that's probably our bigger threat here coming in as the storm builds to the north and west. It's going to get pretty wet here on Saturday and Sunday, especially on Cape Cod. Any shift west here from the European and these heavier amounts of 1 to 2 inches spread back into Boston, we really don't need to see any more rain out of this. We've had severe weather, major flooding in the Leominster area, sinkholes, I mean, you name it. So certainly going to be a mess here. Looking farther up the coast, I think eastern Maine and western New Brunswick are going to take the cake on this rainfall, as amounts are expected to get up as high as maybe 5 to 6 inches, causing flooding here in places like Moncton, St. John, Eastport, Maine, even maybe closer to Caribou could see a couple of inches. Bar Harbor could see 2 to 3 inches. So primarily far eastern parts of New England and parts of Atlantic Canada. In millimeters, for those of you in Canada, these amounts are generally around 100 millimeters near the storm track, maybe as much as 125 millimeters. And then when you get farther to the east, those amounts, of course, are going to come down. Let me show that to you all here. Looking at the St. Lawrence area, we see rain totals, generally speaking, are going to be between 100 and 120 millimeters. And then farther east, amounts will be between 50 and 60 millimeters. Prince Edward Island only expecting 30 to 50 millimeters. So it'll be heavy for a brief amount of time. It's not going to cause major flooding at this point. Taking a look at wind speeds here across the Bay of Fundy, and you can see these numbers coming up, gusting as high as maybe 70 to 75 miles per hour over the open water. On land, though, between 45 and 65 miles per hour. Still pretty intense wind, but not as strong as areas farther to the south. For those of you in Canada, those amounts come up to about 70 to 90 kilometers per hour. Locally, maybe higher than 100 on the south coast here. Bay of Fundy could see wind gusts over 110 to 120 kilometers per hour, getting close to that hurricane force. Prince Edward Island could see wind gusts over 80 kilometers per hour. Eastern parts of Nova Scotia over 70, and then those amounts lessen by the time we get into Sunday. So anyway, that's Lee. Let's talk about the next few systems. Here's the Central Atlantic. You can see there's a trough in place here between Lee and our next system. That's going to guide this system kind of in the same track as Lee, maybe a little farther east. But right now, it's not looking too well developed. It's got a lot of thunderstorm activity, but not really a closed off circulation. The wave behind it does not look super healthy, but we're going to keep an eye on that. And then there's another one behind that. So one of those two could try to develop into Ophelia. Here's a look at Hurricane Margot starting to broaden out and get wind shear out of the west and southwest. And I don't think it'll be a hurricane for a lot longer, probably a tropical storm by later this morning. Still a big storm, though, with a lot of surf, but no threat to land. Expected to take a loop and weaken as it does so into cooler waters. and become post-tropical by the time we get to about next Tuesday or Wednesday. And you can see the wind speed forecasts generally are gradually weakening over the next few days, and then down to a post-tropical by the time we get to Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Here's our disturbance, 97L. A huge area of thunderstorms, but not really a low-level circulation, so it's still got a bit of time before it becomes our next depression. That may not happen until either later tomorrow night or sometime on Saturday, but it is expected to strengthen, and it's expected to turn to the northwest, getting kind of induced by that upper level feature, so it'll stay well to the northeast of the islands here. You can see Bermuda on the map here does need to keep a close eye on this. There's certainly some ensembles and some tropical guidance that basically take the storm in here and continue it in the general direction of Bermuda. And then there's some guidance that has it turning away to the right. So instead of going west of you in Bermuda, it's either going to be near or to the right of you. And that's something we certainly need to be watching for here by the time we get later into next week. The other thing I'll show you is that all the models show this system developing into a tropical storm by the weekend, and then many take it to hurricane strength early next week. So it could try to rapidly intensify up to Category 4 here by the middle of next week over those very warm waters just to the east of where Hurricane Lee came. So this will likely be Hurricane Nigel by the time we're talking Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. After that, we'll have to keep an eye on things. The European model ensemble spread turns to the right of Bermuda, but there are ensembles that go near Bermuda, so we're going to keep an eye on that. Pretty much all the ensembles have this as a hurricane with pressures basically in the 950s and 960s, which would be Category 3. One ensemble makes it a Category 4 at 935, one has it at 943, one has it at 940. So the ensembles all agree this is going to be a hurricane, and many show it as a strong hurricane, probably our fourth major for the year. I'll look at the widespread picture here. You can see the three storms on the map. Hurricane Lee landfalling Saturday night in the Bay of Fundy as probably a tropical storm at that point. We see weakening Tropical Storm Margot, then we see developing Depression 15/Tropical Storm Nigel here over the central Atlantic Saturday night. That continues northwest. It has a little bit of influence, by the way, by this ridge that builds in and stalls the forward progress of Margot. So these two systems kind of get trapped. Then we see an area of high pressure building, which will turn this back more towards the west-northwest. If you extrapolated that, that would take it right into the Carolinas. However, there's another trough moving through the central U.S. that will protect the East Coast. So this storm will strengthen a lot like Lee did. I don't know if it gets to Category 5, but 3 or 4 seems more likely. And then you see a track from the European basically right over Bermuda here next Friday. So we only go about 7 days between one storm to the next in Bermuda. Then it looks like it's going to turn away to the northeast, but we need to watch it in the Maritimes of Canada. Here's our next system developing into Tropical Storm Ophelia, but that is way too far off to try to predict at this point. The control run of the ensemble shows a very similar setup to what the operational. It has low pressure tracking just west of Bermuda, putting Bermuda kind of on the dirty side of this system next Friday morning, maybe even next Thursday night. So if you're in Bermuda and you're dealing with a storm now, I would be very much ready to prepare for the next one, which could hit us as soon as 7.5 days from now. You will see that the control does turn it away before it gets to Nova Scotia and keeps it over the open channels. But it's amazing that such a small target like Bermuda gets into so many watches and warnings. I mean, this would be our fourth storm potentially here this summer, and this is pretty amazing. Oh, by the way, it does take what could be Ophelia and turns it away. It kind of gets lifted out by the same trough created here by Nigel. But Nigel likely to be another Lee, maybe not quite a Cat 5, but another big storm moving over the north central and then northeastern Atlantic. Here's a closer look at the control run. You can see taking it up through the Bay of Fundy is Lee. That's out of the picture by next Monday. High pressure rebuilds. And then here comes Nigel, tracking just to the south and west of Bermuda by next Friday morning, and then making a right turn and weakening. Still be a strong storm, but probably a tropical storm or Category 1 hurricane by the end of next weekend, pulling away. And then a big area of high pressure should warm things back up in the eastern U.S. as we get past this false fall and go back into summer mode here later next week into the following week. We just can't cool things off consistently yet at this point. The GFS model is actually showing a pretty similar situation to what the Euro showed. It's a little farther east here, and then it kind of stalls the system. It's got a stronger area of high pressure building into the northeast, and that turns what should be Nigel back to the west, and the GFS is punishing Bermuda here with over 24 hours of hurricane conditions, and I really hope that's not the case. but it's something we do need to keep an eye on. The GFS, by the way, because of the strength of that ridge, pulls us up into the Nova Scotia area and then Newfoundland before heading away. So it's slower and makes kind of a more of a severe turn back around to the north and east. Here's a closer look at the GFS, and you can see here's Lee. Then we quiet down, and then here comes on the screen here Nigel, which would be a Category 2 or 3 hurricane, moving right over Bermuda here next Friday afternoon, according to this run. And it's moving slowly. It's not speeding up like Lee. It's actually moving kind of slowly here, kind of stuck between the ridge and the next trough. And then next weekend, it could impact Atlantic Canada and eastern Maine again here before turning away. I mean, this is a 250-hour forecast. The errors at this point could be 500 miles. There's no one that says this couldn't be coming through New England or spreading east and turning away from Canada. So we've got a lot of time to watch, but just be on the lookout for potentially another impactful storm, potentially. Here's a look at the Canadian model, and you can see that it is strengthening Nigel into a hurricane here by the middle of next week, and it too takes a storm very close to Bermuda. If you zoom in, I'll show that to you here. Where's my pressure? Yeah, I got 981 here next. I mean, basically, the Canadian doesn't do a great job on this, but yeah, basically within 100 miles of Bermuda. So all the major models, the Canadian, the European, and the GFS model, take this storm within 100 miles of Bermuda next Friday. So stay tuned on that. Here's the tropical model, the HAFS, showing our system beginning to develop here tomorrow afternoon into a tropical storm. So we may have a tropical storm before the weekend. This would be Nigel. And then you see it starts turning away to the west-northwest and becomes a large hurricane. The HAFS says it's a Category 4 hurricane early next week. It's rapidly intensifying between Saturday and Monday. So we could see this one pulling another Lee here. But the difference is that it will probably go over the cooler waters left behind by Lee. And I doubt it gets this strong, 933. By Monday night, Tuesday morning. But hey, things have certainly surprised us before in this industry. I would not be shocked to see another Category 4 knocking on Category 5's door here by Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. The European wind gust forecast here, you can see for Bermuda, we'll see the wind gusts letting up here tomorrow afternoon. We get quieter weather over the weekend with 10-mile-per-hour winds. Enjoy it while you can. Clean up from this storm and get ready for the next one in Bermuda, because as we get into next week, we are going to see wind gusts beginning to pick up next Wednesday night up to 20 to 30 miles per hour, and then up to 50 miles per hour, according to the European here on Thursday night. And hurricane force winds being predicted by the European on Friday, starting very early in the morning on all of Bermuda. Wind gusts could approach 100 miles per hour, according to the European here. And again, this is a 210-hour forecast. It'll likely change, but right now it's not looking great for Bermuda. With these hurricane force winds expected all day on Friday, quieting down by Saturday morning. Stay tuned for that. Appreciate y'all's time. I hope everybody is preparing for this system that's in those watches and warnings, as it will be dangerous. It'll be a large system. Fortunately, it'll be weakening, but still a big system. And then let's start taking a look at Nigel here next week. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing. We do also have the ability, if you feel led to become a member. It's $9.99 a month. And that allows you to support me, and I'll be able to interact with you on a priority here. But as always, I just thank you for your time. I give all the glory to God, who has given me this gift to be a meteorologist and to share the holy gospel with you, the good news. I talked yesterday about not being conformed by the world, but by God. That is the will of God, Romans 12:2. Today I read the next verse, that's 12:3 from Romans, King James Version. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that it is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according to as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Basically, when I first read that, I was like, wow, that's a slap in the face, man. I'm not any better than I think I am. But then I realized, no, what that really means is that God is no respecter of persons. He has created all of us in his image, and gives us all the ability to think soberly, to think seriously that God created us, and that with faith, with belief in the things that are not seen yet, we can accept Christ as our Savior and live eternally with God. So to not have the ego and the pride of the fact that you think you know what's going to happen, because really you don't, but also being humbled by God and understanding that it does take some faith here to realize that we don't really know what's happening when our time on earth is gone. However, we also are no better than the next person. We may have a better paying job, we may be in a better health situation, a financial situation, but we're no better than the other person that God created. So I would like for us all to just kind of treat each other like God's children if we can. And if you're not a believer, I'm not hitting you over the face with a Bible here. I'm not a Bible thumper. I just want you to see that because for a long time in my life, I was not a believer. I was in a dark spot. I really did think I was better than I was, but then I struggled with it because I realized I wasn't. Eventually, when I found God, I realized, you know what? There's a reason here for where I am in life. And I'm humbled by the grace of God. I'm humbled by this news. And I just have to share that with you because as a Christian, uh, the gift that was been given to me, I believe needs to be given to a lot more folks. And I just wanted to share that news with you. So anyway, I hope you have a blessed day. And I am very much happy to pray for you with whatever situation you're going through. I'm here praying for the folks that are being impacted by these storms. I know it's rough. It's very difficult for me to see what's been happening over in places like Benghazi and Morocco. But I realize that God pulls us all together and that we are all created to do more and to help each other and to keep each other in prayer. So I hope you all have a wonderful Thursday and we'll chat again tomorrow morning. God bless you. See you then.